Have you ever opened a book to the exact page you were looking for? Have you ever had a song play incessantly in your head for days on end, only for it to pop onto the radio out of nowhere? Are such coincidences a figment of our imaginations? Or is something else, something truly cosmic, going on? Are they simply random? Or is there some mechanism behind them? At the turn of the 20th century, Austrian biologist Paul Kammerer attempted to answer these questions and took on the monumental task of cataloging as many different coincidences as he could find, from the trite to the grandiose. Of particular interest to him were those coincidences of events that seem to cluster or repeat inexplicably often, such as the number of pedestrians who walk by a particular spot wearing eyeglasses, compared to the population of eyeglass wearers as a whole, or the successive number of times a gambler will win a bet. A specific example of the latter can be found in the 1891 case of Charles Wells, a British confidence artist who, during a July visit to the gambler's mecca of Monte Carlo, cleaned out the cash reserve kept at the roulette table 12 times over the course of 11 hours. Not one to rest on his laurels, Wells returned to the casino the following November and performed a similarly spectacular feat over the course of 3 days, closing out the table another 6 times. Given his background, Wells was suspected of cheating and investigated by French authorities. No evidence was ever found to support such a conclusion, though it is widely believed he used some sort of betting system, such as the martingale, which does not alter the odds in any meaningful way. It seems Wells had simply been lucky. In what he called the law of seriality, Kammerer theorized that coincidences such as Wells' streak of good fortune originate outside the human mind and are manifestations of some underlying structure in the universe, as if information itself had some physical nature that could be analyzed and codified into a set of laws. Roughly speaking, one could think of an event's persistence as related to the concept of inertia, or the attraction of like occurrences akin to gravity. As far-fetched as this sounds, theoretical physicist Albert Einstein himself opined the idea was both interesting and by no means absurd, perhaps viewing it as a logical progression of his own theories about the unity of space and time. Psychoanalyst Carl Jung no doubt took some inspiration from Kammerer for his own theory of synchronicity. Jung argued that many, though not necessarily all, coincidences achieve significance in our lives because they carry some symbolic meaning to either ourselves or a collective unconscious shared by all human beings. One effectively notices a coincidence if one's subconscious deems it useful to make some sort of psychic breakthrough. Events can therefore be closely related by meaning, even if they are totally unconnected causally. Obviously, concepts like Jung's synchronicity and Kammerer's law of seriality cannot be empirically tested and are little more than well-constructed speculation, though this does not mean they are not worthwhile from a philosophical standpoint. But coincidences can very often be wildly overstated, an illusion created from a simple misinterpretation of banal events. A disproportionately high number of people wearing eyeglasses walking past a particular street corner may seem noteworthy until we notice the nearby optician's office. Coincidences can also be the result of mathematical curiosities, which are well understood and explainable, but utterly counterintuitive. For example, the well-known birthday paradox. If we assume that every day of the year is equally likely, the probability that 2 individuals within a group of 23 share the same birthday is about 50%. This seems dubious considering the number of days in a year is so much larger, yet mathematically the total number of possible combinations is much greater than is obvious. Seemingly unlikely events are not really so if viewed from a more objective standpoint. What may seem a mind-blowing circumstance between 2 people might be utterly mundane when those 2 people are mingled into a population of millions. Given enough time and a finite number of possibilities, odd coincidences will inevitably appear. Even if a slot machine is 1,000,000 to 1 against winning a jackpot is bound to be hit by someone in a casino that has millions of patrons passing through every week. One tends to only notice the unusual occurrence, and such is incorrectly deemed mysterious as a result. However, the law of large numbers doesn't immediately explain all coincidence. Large numbers are not infinite. In fact, however mind-bogglingly large a given number is, there is always an infinity of numbers that are larger. Even a numerically impressive sample size can be obliterated by ridiculously low probability. No matter how long a casino's gamblers pull levers and push buttons, the odds are effectively zero that 1,000 of them will all hit a jackpot simultaneously any time before the heat death of the universe. Even the croupier-crushing run of Charles Wells doesn't begin to compare with such an extreme case. Unfortunately, the probabilities of most day-to-day events are not this simple to determine. Games of chance can be calculated with geometrical precision. Machine reels and dice have known numbers of permutations. Random events throughout a person's life generally do not. The odds of randomly pulling a royal flush from a standard deck of playing cards, for example, are about 1 in 650,000. This is easily calculated using elementary mathematics, and provided the initial conditions don't change, will always be the correct result. However, there comes a point when even the most ardent critic of metaphysical explanations will feel uncomfortable. Undoubtedly, there is a sense of being puppeteered by a higher, though not necessarily benevolent, power when we encounter a particularly reality-bending coincidence, as if we are little more than pawns on a chessboard or ignorant automatons playing out one iteration of a program. If a woman stumbles into an old friend she hasn't seen in years as he randomly steps out of a taxi, one might be inclined to dismiss this as a memorable, if meaningless, coincidence. But what if said friend later stepped out of a different taxi in a foreign country on the one day the woman happened to be passing through with a tour group? What if the taxi driver had the same name in both instances? And what if both events occurred at 4:17 in the afternoon on July 15th? The sinking of the RMS Titanic in the spring of 1912 has been fuel for historians and romanticists for over a century, a microcosm of glamour, poverty, hubris, tragedy, nature, and technology. No maritime disaster has received more scrutiny in the public eye, and none likely will for the foreseeable future. It should come as no surprise, then, that a host of strange goings-on have been linked to the once mighty ship of dreams. In 1898, author Morgan Robinson published a novella entitled Futility, or The Wreck of the Titan, in a later edition. In the first half of Robertson's story, a passenger liner named the Titan sets sail from its British home port across the Atlantic, eventually sinking after an ill-fated encounter with an iceberg, a summary which echoes the real-life tragedy of the Titanic. But that's not all. The Titan, Robertson writes, was called the largest craft afloat and the greatest works of men, and thought to be practically unsinkable. This is, of course, a well-known descriptor of the Titanic, the phrase even published in White Star brochures before the ill-fated voyage. Likewise, both ships were heralded as the pinnacle of luxury, on par with the best hotels on Earth. Both the Titan and the Titanic were fitted with triple screws, although the Titan's engine was slightly smaller, and designed with state-of-the-art watertight compartments. Each ship had capacity for 3,000 passengers, and crew were of a similar length and tonnage. Similar short-sightedness plagued both liners as well. The Titan was only outfitted with 24 lifeboats, the fewest the law would allow. The Titanic was outfitted with only 20, 4 of which were collapsible Inglehearts. In both reality and fantasy, the associated boats could only accommodate about half of their respective passengers. The fateful night was in April, around midnight, and both ships suffered damage to their starboard side as their respective crews attempted to navigate around a looming iceberg located about 400 miles off the coast of Newfoundland. Numerically, the Titan's ultimate death toll was much higher, at just under 3,000. The Titanic's count was, of course, real and therefore infinitely worse. Amazingly, Robertson's work of fiction was originally published 14 years before the very factual sinking of the Titanic. Robertson took his seeming precognizance in stride, claiming his novella to be based upon his substantial knowledge of modern maritime construction. Quote, "I know what I'm writing about, that's all." Unquote. As weird as the similarities are, Robertson's very simple explanation is not without merit. The overall design and construction of the Titan fits within the technological boundaries of the age, and any similarities between associated details could therefore be chalked up to logical deduction and an instinctual understanding of the pitfalls of human pride. The damage inflicted upon a large vessel by a passing iceberg is both easy to imagine and difficult to exaggerate. On the other hand, the exactness of the time and place of the fictional events are genuinely intriguing, even if they are informed guesses. Another lesser-known work was written by newspaper editor William Thomas Stead. In 1886, Stead published a story with the rather verbose title of How the Mail Steamer Went Down in Mid-Atlantic by a Survivor. Stead's disaster was nowhere near as on the mark as Robertson's. The former's narrative occurs in a different location and is the result of a collision between two vessels in a fog bank. However, the shortage of lifeboats is a prominent feature, which eerily echoes one of the Titanic's more well-known flaws. In 1892, Stead also published a story titled From the Old World to the New, in which a ship from the White Star Line rescues victims of a second ship, which collides with an iceberg in the North Atlantic, a strange collection of details that seems to be a jumbled recreation of events 20 years in the future. Unlike Robertson, who died in 1915 of a drug overdose, Stead's own fate seems too ironic to believe. He was last seen half dead, clinging to the gunwale of a lifeboat in the frigid waters of the North Atlantic, one of the many hundreds of victims of the Titanic. In July of 1940, newlywed D.J. Page, a British Army private, eagerly opened his mail in the hopes of seeing photographs of his recent nuptials. At first, Page was disappointed to discover his parcel of photos had been mistakenly opened by another private from Troop A, but soon grew astonished when he read the details written in an included letter of apology. Private D.J. Page realized the other man was named Pape. Pape's service number was 1509322, which only differed sequentially from his own by 1. Years later, while working for London Transport as a bus driver, Mr. Page stopped by his supervisor's office to discuss an error with his paycheck. It turned out his check was mistakenly switched with that of another driver who had recently transferred, a man named Pape, in fact, the very same individual as before. The coincidence became even more absurd when Page discovered his doppelganger's license number was 29223, again, just one digit away from his own. It is certainly true that a clerical mix-up over similar names is hardly inexplicable, and one may be tempted to dismiss the respective numbers of each man as nothing more than an artifact of the corresponding alphabetization of their names. But service numbers, both military and civilian, are generally issued chronologically, not alphabetically. So both Mr. Page and Mr. Pape would have to have unknowingly entered the Army and then later the Transport Service at the same time. The June 6, 1944 Allied invasion of the Normandy beachhead had existed under a dark cloud of secrecy for months. Tremendous effort was put toward not only hiding the details of the impending attack from German spies, but to redirecting German efforts to thwart such an attack nearly 250 kilometers to the northeast, at Calais. The lives of uncounted thousands were riding on that secrecy, as was the liberation of the European continent. If the mass amphibious assault failed, Germany would have an opportunity to, at best, consolidate its forces and possibly drive the Allies from the Italian peninsula, and at worst, attempt a second drive into Russia. One can, therefore, have a deep appreciation for the stark panic that gripped the personnel working at MI5, the British counterintelligence agency, in the weeks leading up to the battle. On Tuesday, May 2, 1944, someone in the MI5 office opened a copy of the Daily Telegraph newspaper and eventually noticed something strange on the recreational puzzle page, a crossword with a curious four-letter solution for the clue at 17 across, one of the U.S. The solution, Utah, was in fact the Allied code word for one of the 5 beachheads destined to be stormed by the U.S. 4th Infantry Division and 70th Tank Battalion in only a month hence. Suspicions mounted when, on Monday the 22nd, the 3-down clue for the Telegraph's newest crossword read, Red Indian on the Missouri. The 5-letter answer loomed like a black cloud. Omaha, a beachhead targeted for attack by the U.S. 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions, a battle which would famously be recreated 5 decades later in the movie Saving Private Ryan. The real panic began on the following Saturday, as the daily crossword letters for 11 across, but some bigwig like this has stolen some of it at times, were filled in to read Overlord, which just happened to be the code name for the looming invasion of Normandy. On Tuesday, May 30th, again 11 across read, This bush is a center of nursery revolutions. Mulberry. Mulberry harbors were portable floating harbors designed to assist in the rapid transfer of cargo onto a beach after a successful amphibious assault. 2 separate mulberries were due to be erected along the Normandy shore, one of them off of Omaha Beach. And finally, on Thursday, June 1st, with less than a week before D-Day, the clue for 15 down ran, "Britannia and he hold the same thing, Neptune." Operation Neptune was the code name used for the offshore naval portion of the Normandy invasion. The pattern was clear, as was the conclusion. A German spy was passing information about the upcoming invasion of the Normandy coast through the puzzle page of the Daily Telegraph. MI5 quickly traced the origin of the puzzles to a 54-year-old man named Leonard Daw, headmaster of Strand School, a private school for boys in the Surrey countryside. During his free time, Daw had, since 1925, worked as a crossword compiler for the Daily Telegraph, concocting thousands of the popular puzzles for the amusement of the British public. Though well respected, he had a reputation as a private man and a disciplinarian. To the paranoid agents of military counterintelligence, he seemed an obvious spy. Daw, as well as a second crossword compiler who lived in the nearby community of Bury St. Edmunds, a man named Melville Jones, was arrested at once and subjected to a thorough interrogation. About the incident, Daw would later comment, quote, "They turned me inside out and put Melville through the works, but they eventually decided not to shoot us after all," unquote. Daw's obvious indignity at having been thought a traitor, as well as his apparent ignorance of the significance of the words in question, convinced MI5 the whole affair had been a fluke. Apparently, in his zeal for efficiency, Headmaster Daw had taken to the habit of passing out blank crosswords to the boys at the school, with which they could fill in whatever unusual words they could think of. Daw would then reverse engineer clues from these words, add them to his own, and complete his puzzles in due course. In a radio interview with the BBC in 1958, Daw explained that after his interrogation by MI5, he did his own investigation and learned that some of the boys had been using words that they had heard from the soldiers at the nearby military encampment, many of whom were training for the assault on Normandy. As verification, he was shown a notebook full of these words owned by one of the boys. Understandably shocked by this unintended breach of national security, Daw had the notebook burned and swore all the boys to secrecy. In 1984, a letter sent to the Times by a former student of Strand School, a man named Ronald French, more or less confirmed the headmaster's version of the events, stating that he and his fellow classmates had injected the words they heard into the crosswords, certain that most of the school had been aware of them. Indeed, the 1980 letter may have been an attempt to use a plausible story to nullify long-standing suspicions about Headmaster Daw, who died in 1973. Admittedly, Daw would have very little reason to concoct his own narrative of finding the words in the notebook of a pupil. Laying the blame for something like attempted espionage at the feet of a teenage boy would be wildly out of character for the man, not to mention reprehensible. However, regardless of how lax military security was in the Surrey area, the mantras of "careless talk costs lives" and "loose lips sink ships" had been propaganda staples for some time over the whole of England and America. Allied soldiers and teenage schoolboys alike would certainly be aware of the impropriety of repeating something not meant for public consumption, even surreptitiously. Headmaster Daw would certainly not be telling the boys anything they didn't already know. Furthermore, pertinent code words, if they were even widely known, would probably not be bandied about between military personnel as casually as the 1984 confession would make it seem, despite claims of broad access to the camp, even being allowed to at one point drive a tank. And while it's likely no Allied soldier would view local boys as potential Nazi spies, would anyone in the know really have allowed a curious child to follow them around with a notebook? Oddly, the solutions Juno, Gold, and Sword, codenames for other beachheads due to be invaded, had also appeared in the Telegraph's crosswords in April of 1944. These had come to the attention of MI5 as well, but they had been considered innocent coincidences, as the words were commonplace, although how Juno, the Roman version of the Greek goddess Hera, was considered commonplace and Neptune was not, is a mystery in its own right. As an explanation, the inadvertent transfer of knowledge is as good as any. Perhaps more than anything, such an explanation stands as a testament to the fairy tale of military secrets. A somewhat more authentic coincidence occurred at about 11:30 p.m. on June 5th, when over 6,600 members of the U.S. 101st Airborne were riding in a fleet of C-47s en route to the French countryside and an early morning date with destiny. One of the soldiers, a Private Robert C. Hillman of Manchester, Connecticut, pointed out a remarkable circumstance to the man sitting next to him, NBC war correspondent Wright Brown. It seems Private Hillman's mother, who worked as an inspector for the Pioneer Parachute Company, had inspected his own equipment, as indicated by her initials written in her own hand on the tag stitched to the flap. The manufacturing and packing of Type T5 parachutes required the strictest quality control imaginable, otherwise soldiers might find themselves jumping to a certain death. Pioneer Parachute, which, like Private Hillman's home, was located in Manchester, Connecticut, was one such manufacturer. Dozens of American companies produced parachutes for Allied forces all around the world, used by the hundreds or thousands at a time. There would have been no conceivable way for Mrs. Hillman to ensure her son had received something which she had personally signed. Another strange tale from England concerns an event which occurred between the post-war years of 1952 and 1953, involving the famed oboist Leon Goossens. While crossing an overgrown field one day in 1952, it seems Mr. Goossens accidentally dropped his new pocket diary, one he had purchased only weeks earlier to replace another one he had left on a bus. The flustered man spent a few moments trying to find it amidst the grass, but as he had been heading to an appointment, decided to forget the matter and be on his way. About a year later, Goossens, during a more leisurely stroll, found himself walking through the same field, when he momentarily stopped to light a cigar. He happened to glance down at his feet and see his long-forgotten diary, now weather-beaten and tattered, laying within the grass. As he picked up the sad little book, he noticed the binding had split open to reveal a square cutting of old newsprint, the use of which was once a common practice in bookbindery to stiffen the book's cover, the copy of which was an announcement of his marriage to his second wife 19 years before. Probably the most often cited set of coincidental events are those supposedly found between American presidents Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy. A sampling of claims and common objections are as follows. Both men were elected to the U.S. Congress in the 46th year of their respective centuries. Likewise, both were elected to the presidency in the 60th year. This is not really all that remarkable when one considers the limited number of years and elections possible for each man. Also, to have a man who served as a U.S. president serve as a lesser public official beforehand is not in any way unusual. Both men have surnames comprised of 7 letters. Both had successors named Johnson. Dozens of surnames common to both men's eras also had 7 letters: Bennett, Adamson, Jackson, Stanton, Benning, Stewart, etc. This would also hold true for each man's successor, Andrew Johnson and Lyndon Johnson. Lincoln's secretary, a man named Kennedy, warned him not to travel to Ford's Theater. Kennedy's secretary, named Lincoln, warned him not to go to Dallas. Unfortunately, this oft-quoted fact is only half true. John Kennedy did have a secretary named Evelyn Lincoln, but there is no evidence of a Kennedy working in the Lincoln administration. The private secretaries of Lincoln were in fact named John George Nicolay and John Milton Hay. To point out that both Johns shared the first name of President Kennedy would be a stretch, to say the least, and unless any warnings issued, contained extraordinarily specific details, such as, if you attend this event, you will be shot in the back of the head, they should be viewed as nothing more than a commonplace concern. Being a U.S. president is often a thankless and a dangerous job, the specter of assassination ever present. Both were assassinated on a Friday. Both died via gunshot to the head, and both died in a location near the scene of the attack. The day of the week is a very shallow bit of evidence. There are only 7 to choose from, after all, and the fact that any reasonably competent assassin would choose either the heart or the head as a target, the 2 most vital parts of the human body, should not come as a shock to anyone. Also, it is unlikely a person of such import with such a grievous wound would be transported very far, especially if said person was not physically stable. Simply getting the person out of harm's way and to the closest safe place would probably be the topmost priority. Both men were assassinated by a Southerner. Though John Wilkes Booth was a staunch supporter of the Confederacy, he was born in Maryland, which, although geographically considered a southern state, was a border state during the Civil War and did not officially secede from the Union. Lee Harvey Oswald was born in New Orleans, Louisiana, but he never pushed any specifically southern political ideology. Both assassins were known by 3 names, each comprised of 15 letters: John Wilkes Booth and Lee Harvey Oswald. Many people in the English-speaking world have middle names. Infamous individuals are often referred to by three names in the press to lessen the likelihood of mistaken identity and to pump up the grandiosity of the doer of the deed. John Wayne Gacy is much more memorable than John Gacy, if only due to the similarity with the movie star of yesteryear. Booth escaped from a theater only to be caught in a warehouse. Oswald escaped from a warehouse only to be caught in a theater. Booth did indeed shoot Lincoln in a theater, but he fled to a Virginia farm owned by the Garrett family, where he and a compatriot found themselves locked in a barn that was eventually burned down in an effort to flush the assassin out into the open. Oswald fired his rifle from a book depository, indeed a type of warehouse, and fled on foot, eventually caught hiding in a movie theater after fatally shooting a Dallas police officer in the interim. The human mind is very pattern-oriented and tends to make connections between remote subjects when even the slimmest implications exist. For example, one could compare Adolf Hitler to Napoleon Bonaparte. Both men were born in a country foreign to that which they ultimately ruled. Both men claimed and demonstrated an eidetic memory and were known for explosive tempers. Both Napoleon's coup d'etat and Hitler's beer hall putsch, effectively an attempted coup d'etat, both occurred on November 9th. Both men commenced an invasion of Russia and made intense preparations to invade England. The armies of both men captured the Lithuanian city of Vilnius on June 24th. Their respective armies also stopped their advance just outside of Moscow, only to be pushed back to their respective starting positions in half the time. Obviously, many of these coincidental facts are prosaically explained. Many people have a bad temper. Vilnius is an obvious strategic point of interest. Relocating from one's birthplace while a child is not in any way unusual. Connections of random facts are simply not enough to label a coincidence truly remarkable, as any standards used may be so broad as to make these connections trivial. One of the strangest incidents of parallel lives between separate individuals centers around the murders of Mary Ashford and Barbara Forrest, a pair of crimes committed in Erdington, England in 1817 and 1974, 157 years apart. On May 27, 1817, the body of 20-year-old housekeeper Mary Ashford was found on the outskirts of town, face down in a flooded sandpit. A man named Abraham Thornton was subsequently arrested by police and put on trial, accused of physically assaulting the young woman, who was last seen walking home just after 4 a.m., and either killing her or leaving her to die in the muck. He was eventually found not guilty due to lack of evidence. What witness testimony there was did not place him at the scene of the crime, and very little circumstantial evidence connected him to any wrongdoing. Thornton was then tried a second time, a not unheard of occurrence in that era, and to the shock of everyone in the court, demanded a trial by battle, essentially allowing his guilt or innocence to be determined by a duel to the death with his accuser, in this case the victim's brother William. When William Ashford refused, after the request for a duel was deemed lawful, Thornton was set free. On June 3, 1974, the body of 20-year-old nurse Barbara Forrest was found on the outskirts of Pipe Hayes Park, obscured by tall grass, only about 400 yards from the location of Mary Ashford's body a century and a half earlier. This seems a rather unexceptional bit of information until Ms. Forrest's time of death is considered, the morning of May 27th, sometime after 1 a.m. She was last seen disembarking the number 67 bus on Tyburn Road about this time, with only about a 10-minute walk to get to her front door. It is likely the body of Ms. Forrest was deliberately hidden from view, thus resulting in discovery 8 days after the deed. Perhaps most intriguing of all, the primary suspect in the murder was a man named Michael Ian Thornton. Michael Thornton was a supervisor at the Pipe Hayes Children's Home, where Barbara Forrest was employed. Like his 19th century counterpart, Thornton was quickly brought to trial and eventually found not guilty due to lack of evidence, although unexplained bloodstains were found on a pair of his trousers, and his alibi for the likely time of Ms. Forrest's demise was shown to be based on a fabrication. Due to partial disrobement and lacerations located around the genitalia, it was determined in both cases the women had been victims of sexual assault. Abraham Thornton did admit to intercourse with Mary Ashford, but he claimed it was entirely consensual. Both women had left their respective places of employment on the afternoon of May the 26th and visited a friend's house, where they each changed from their work clothes into attire appropriate for a night out with friends. Both women then spent the evening dancing. Ms. Ashford with her friend Hannah Cox at the Tyburn House Inn, where she supposedly met Thornton, and Ms. Forrest at various pubs in the downtown area with her boyfriend, 21-year-old Simon Belcher. Murders do occur, of course, and young women are often the victims of sexual assault. Neither of these facts would suggest an unusual coincidence. But to have similar crimes happen to similar individuals at similar times, at similar locations, by similar people, at least in name, is at least a little astounding. With billions of people in the world, one would expect a sizable duplication between subjects. Even with a relatively small population, one would reasonably expect some, as demonstrated by the birthday paradox. But dates of birth and death are not at issue here. It is the dates of rape and murder. Murder and rape are distinctly aberrant behaviors. A very small percentage of people will carry out such acts, and a tiny percentage of those suspected will be named Thornton, and an even tinier percentage of those people will live in the Erdington area at the appropriate time. To have the victims both doing more or less the same things on the evening prior to their death, and then to have both suspects receive the same discharge for lack of evidence, seems incredible when viewed in context. It is possible that the latter crime of Ms. Forrest was inspired by that of Ms. Ashford, in which case there would be no coincidence. The idea is not all that implausible. The murder of Mary Ashford and subsequent trials of Abraham Thornton has been a well-known case for some time, in no small part to Mr. Thornton's bizarre insistence of trial by combat. Naturally, this assumes the perpetrator was trying to duplicate the original circumstances, which is an absurd notion when we consider certain details. If Michael Thornton, the suspect in the Forrest case, was not the actual murderer and had been framed by a copycat to complete a 20th century reenactment of the 1817 murder, we again face the stunning coincidence that a man with a necessary and fairly uncommon name lived nearby and was known to have previously interacted with the victim in some notable capacity. On the other hand, if Michael Thornton did murder Ms. Forrest, then he would have to be said copycat, which would mean he was essentially making himself the obvious target for investigation. A very risky strategy to say the least, considering the lack of control he would have in regards to trace evidence and possible witnesses. How would such a devious individual duplicate such minutiae as Barbara Forrest changing clothes at a friend's house and spending the night in a similar fashion as Ms. Ashford? And if duplication of a crime was a motive, why would the body of Ms. Forrest, who was strangled, be disposed of in an entirely different manner than Ms. Ashford, who had been assaulted and thrown face down into a small body of water, ultimately drowning because of her weakened state? Answers concerning the death of Mary Ashford are undoubtedly lost to history. The murder of Barbara Forrest, however, has not been officially closed, and in light of modern forensics may yet see new avenues to explore. Whether this would alter the puzzling relationship between the two murders isn't clear. The vast majority of coincidences we experience do little more than spice up a dull afternoon. Very few moments are memorable enough to recall without prompting, and even fewer will shake us from our own paths of certainty. History is replete with moments so unlikely that they defy reason, leaving us to wonder about the connections possibly underlying the whole of existence. Perhaps all coincidences are just an illusion, born from our need to see patterns in the unfurling canvas of life. Or perhaps they are the reminders that the universe and all which lives within it are a jigsaw puzzle of unimaginable complexity, and that every once in a while, two pieces will fit nicely together.